Hello and welcome to episode 16 of the FootMarks podcast. I'm your host Behram Qazi. You can find me at Def Mango on Twitter, and with me, of course, is Jarrod Kimber. As always, you can find him everywhere. So the premise of this podcast is Wahab Riaz. I'm going to call it Wowed by Wahab because it sounds nice. And here's the story, some backstory for you guys. So Wahab retired recently from international cricket. He took 237 wickets in 174 international innings. And I wrote a piece for him for Dawn, which is a Pakistani newspaper. And then, Jarrod went on and wrote a better piece, which was way more visual and fun to read. So I'll just ask you straight up, Jarrod, what was the inspiration? What was that one thing that I wrote in the piece which made you go like, okay, no, I got to do this better?
I think I was going to copy your piece and just do it as a video on Dawn. And then I realized that you'd written a really, really good piece. But I felt that you had written a really good piece for Pakistani fans. And also, every time I read something in your piece, it was really interesting. But then when I got into research, I'd find like 5 other things. And so I reckon I copied the entire thing of your article and then just kept moving it down further. But what I used it as really was the spine of the research. I didn't want to miss anything. But I think I knew what people were going to write. And I thought that most people would write, oh, he was really great, but he maybe didn't quite have the numbers that he was supposed to have. Or I thought people were going to write, he was overrated, and I don't even know why we're still talking about him. And I thought, if you look at it, he's not a particularly relevant cricketer.
Yeah.
That when he retires, that we should... He didn't get 100 test wickets.
No, he did not.
How many one-day wickets? Do you remember? Off the top of your
Just
head?
over 100.
Yeah. Barely played in the international T20 as well.
Yeah.
Right? Never played in the IPL. Not his fault, obviously. He definitely would have played in the IPL without the politics. And yet, we all have Wahab memories, right? Like, that was the thing that I kept going on about. Because I don't write pieces for everyone. But what I really wanted to do, and I thought you wrote a really good encapsulation of his career. And what I really wanted to do was something slightly different and just be like, why is it that we're talking about this cricketer who didn't do that much at international level, and yet when he retired, there's not a cricket fan in the world that didn't have an image of him running in and bowling. Yeah. And I think that for me that means that there's something about his play. And I thought you did a very good story of who he was and what his career was. But I really wanted to get to that essence of this guy mattered, even though if you just look at his numbers, he probably should not have mattered.
Yeah, no, you very rightfully call him a moments cricketer who gave a lot of memories as opposed to a stats cricketer. So just on that note, based on the many memories of Wahab Riaz, which we'll get into, I want to ask you, because I've followed his career from the start, right? I remember his debut game in ODI cricket when he took like 2 for something versus Zimbabwe in Sheikhupura. But what is your first memory of Wahab Riaz? When did you see him first?
Did he play limited overs against Australia in 2010?
2010, when Australia toured the UAE?
No, England. When
he's
on that.
No, I think it was Shoaib Akhtar. He made a comeback. Then there was Umar Gul.
Did he play against England in limited overs around that time? I've got a feeling that I saw him in the nets around that era in a squad, and I covered both of those series. So, and it may not even be that series. It might have been another one, because I know I missed the Test series, and he did when he played for England, because he took he took a 5-wicket haul against England at the Oval.
Yeah, on debut.
Yeah, and I know I wasn't around for that. I want to say, I'm just trying to have a look at his one-day record now, but I want to say that like right early on in limited overs or even T20 cricket, I saw him in person, and I remember being struck by he doesn't have a particularly Pakistani physicality about his bowling, right? He actually probably bowls more like an Australian kind of a seam bowler, a little bit more physical and strong, and rather than lithe and, athletic. Not that he's not athletic, but he's athletic in a more of a different kind of way. And I remember seeing him in the nets around that time. And someone had told me about him. And, whichever series I was covering at the time. And I remember seeing him and going, this guy doesn't even look like a Pakistani bowler. Like, there was just something a little bit off about, the way that he was. And I suppose, again, that goes back to, I do think that watching him bowl, there was a very physical way that he went about it that I think left an imprint. And I don't remember him taking a bunch of wickets in, an early game that I saw him play in. But I do remember him bowling in the nets in front of me and thinking that's a thing. That's a thing worth remembering. And then the next time was probably around the the jacket story. When he and at that stage he was, you've always got players on your mind, but I don't think he was really front and center up until that story.
Yeah, no, the jacket story was when we knew of him, I guess, early on, or well, at least in the international media, because, we'd been following him in Pakistan, but maybe he didn't have that international reputation. And then he went on to do some stuff in World Cups, and we'll get to that. But you speak of Wahab having this physical presence. You speak of him as a visceral bowler, someone who will give you that moment and moments that we all remember, and someone who we will never get out of our minds. Just if you've witnessed Wahab, even at his best or worst, you'll remember him. He's that sort of a guy, wears his heart on his sleeve. Who would you compare him to when you think of other fast bowlers, who you've seen ever since you followed the game?
Yeah, he's interesting because I don't know if there's another natural comp for someone who has been around for 14, 15 years, and yet we only really saw him at major events. And usually that would be more to do with injury, whereas it wasn't always. Not to say he didn't get injured a lot, because he obviously had some injury problems. Yeah. But it felt like Pakistan just would have periods where they didn't quite rate him. I'm not sure there is another direct comp for the kind of cricketer that he is. He sort of bustled through the crease like almost like a right arm. You see a lot of right arm bowlers do, but left arm bowlers don't usually have that kind of strength through the crease that he does. He wasn't particularly tall. He wasn't always particularly skillful. He didn't always control the ball, and yet he could be incredibly skillful when he needed to be. At his best, he's like a hodgepodge of a lot of different bowlers, and so you could see why he's the sort of bowler that you would never give up on, but also the kind of bowler you might never feel that comfortable with.
Yeah, I understand that. And it's interesting because had those other Pakistani boys, Amir and Asif, not gotten banned and caught for spot fixing, we might not have seen a lot of Wahab Riaz, right? Because Pakistan would have had them as resources. But it's interesting when we look at his test career, it does not make for great reading. There are 83 wickets in 27 outings. But again, he had his moments. Like you mentioned, his debut game at the Oval. Pakistan won that game when he got a 5-wicket haul on debut. And then the spell that I remember is in 2015, which I think defines his test career, even though, there's not, like I said, much to write home about. But England were touring the UAE, and the first test match had been drawn. In fact, if anything, England could have won that test match because Adil Rashid spun a web in the second innings, and Pakistan were almost down and out, but bad light saved them. Also something that Wahab was very animated about. He was like, I can't see, and this and that. But in the second test, in the desert heat in Dubai, he was an absolute workhorse, and he delivered that spell that eventually won Pakistan the game. He got a well-set Joe Root out, and then he went on to get Butler and Stokes out as well. Had Moeen earlier in the game, who was opening in that test. Funny how we were literally doing a pod on Moeen the other day of how he's played in all these positions. But, he won Pakistan that test. He was the man of the match, and I just feel like it was a career in whites that could have been so much more. I feel it was a little bit unfulfilled because I think that someone who had Wahab's skill set could have been a very potent bowler in unfriendly bowling conditions because he did have the pace, right?
What I think the problem is, if I asked you what his stock ball in Test cricket was, what would your answer be?
Maybe back of the length, something that rushes the batters, gets a glove to the keeper, something like that. Because
but that's not a stock ball, is it? Like, if you're getting a glove to the keeper, do you know what I mean? Like, he had those balls. You could give me his Yorker, certainly his bouncer, But what was his best probing stock ball that he could bowl over and over again? He didn't really have a line and a length.
No, tight lines are not something you associate with Wahab Riaz at all. Like, he was quite wavered and very,
we've seen Mitchell
very
Stark,
erratic.
Exactly. We've seen Mitchell Stark do that, but from a foot taller. Right? And so if he was taller, Morne Morkel was probably another good example of a bowler that could be a little bit like that at times as well. He didn't have the ability to bowl 6 balls, and I'm not saying he had to be completely accurate because he's a fast bowler. It's okay if he spread it around a little, but he didn't have the ability to bowl 6 balls in a particular spot that would put pressure on the batters. So if you look at his test bowling, he was either bowling good or he's bowling poor. It was very rarely he was just bowling, right? And it's those sorts of spells that can keep you in it, and that's how you clock up your wickets, right? You know, you want your stock ball. Your stock ball doesn't have to take wickets all the time, but your stock ball has to be good enough so there is a position. And he didn't have, and you think about him as a bowler, he doesn't really have a line or a length that consistently put pressure on batters. It was individual balls with him. And I think that is a big part of perhaps why he didn't do that. And that could be coaching as well, right? Like, it could have been that they didn't go in. I remember one spell, I want to say, at Lords when Pakistan beat England under Misbah, the push-up game, I think it was. When Misbah very, very late decided that he was just going to bowl his left arm seamers 3 feet outside off stump and drifting away towards the slips. There's a little bit of reverse there, but a lot of it was just the angle across. And I remember at the time, I might have even written about this at the time, thinking, if Wahab did that on the days when it wasn't quite working, I remember a young Mitchell Johnson, I won't name the player, but a test player said to me once, the only reason right-handers ever get out to Mitchell Johnson is because he bowls so wide all the time. Eventually you get bored and you chase one. Because he's so quick, you edge it, right? Wahab could have actually done that, right? He could have tried something a little bit different, but he didn't have, if you compare him to Trent Boult or... I'm trying to think maybe some of the other left armers, Mohammad Asif. Their best ball is probably, top of off stump, just coming back in, occasionally getting the ball to go straight across. His best ball, I couldn't tell you what line or length he would have been best at bowling in Test cricket, because I think if he knew that, he would have bowled it over and over again. And that you take that away from any bowler, and it doesn't matter how special some of their other skills are. I've often said this, that being in Test cricket, having a really top quality stock ball, even if it doesn't take a lot of wickets, is far more important than having the best outswinger in the world or the best in-swinger of the world or a flipper or a zooter or anything else, right? You just need that ball that 17 out of 18 balls in any situation you can bowl. The opposition isn't going to score that much. You put a little bit of pressure on them, and then you can push them around the crease and look for other things. And I'm not sure he had that particular skill. But what he had was, I think because he did have a physical run-up, and it looked like he was kind of fighting it his whole career. When he did get that rhythm exactly as he did have that little bit of extra pace. And that's when the other bits don't matter as much. But it's on the days when he was bowling 87 and 88 miles an hour where I think he becomes much more playable, just because he doesn't have those other skill sets available to him.
Right. And of course, he came across as an enforcer in red ball cricket. He was, as you said, never a stock bowler, never kept it tight. And, again, had his moments, but wasn't consistent one bit. Even Wahab, the T20 player, he's an interesting case study in T20 cricket, because at international level, he couldn't quite cut it. And Pakistan was blessed with a lot of talented T20 bowlers ever since the inception of the format. And they've been a good team in T20 cricket. You could say that's their best format at times, even though right now maybe it's ODI cricket, who knows. But to date, he is the highest wicket taker in the PSL and has the second best average in the PSL. And like you mentioned in your piece, crazy good in the BPL, like ridiculously crazy, and also consistent threat in the CPL and Vitality Blast as well. So do you think he might have been spoken of more as a T20 player had he gotten the opportunity to play the IPL? Because that's something that evaded him and every other Pakistani bowler of his generation.
He only bowled 36 T20 internationals.
Yeah.
He's got a bowling average of 28. He's got quite a high economy in those.
He's got less than a wicket per innings in T20 internationals.
Yeah. But an average of 28. So it's it's not bad by any stretch. I wonder if he just played more, if that record just flattens out a little bit and he gets a couple of 4 for 20 games. And, you know, because we know when everything was working for him, you know, he was a handful in T20 cricket. And I can't see any reason why that would not be the case. I think at the top level of T20 cricket, it would have been interesting to see him in the IPL. But even when we did see him in an international cricket, he was very good at bossing lower order players in franchise cricket. And they tend to be of a lower quality, right? You don't get many guys who can bat, you know, at 7, 8, 9 in T20 cricket. And I do wonder if that was his limit, or if he just plays more international cricket, he works it out. But, you know, I talk about in the piece the great Steve Smith ball of, you know, where, and I was at that game. It was up north.
It was in India.
Mohali?
And maybe because I remember Glenn Maxwell's reaction. He went absolutely bonkers. He couldn't believe it, and neither could we.
So I remember I want to say me and Sid Monga were covering that game. I think we were doing an experiment on fielding because we were both keeping fielding metrics. And so we were watching that particular game. And when that happened, like, we must have watched the replay between us 4,000 times each because it's so interesting. Steve Smith is batting outside off stump before Wahab bowls. He then, as Wahab hits the crease, he basically walks so far wide of off stump. And yet at no stage does Wahab Riaz think, well, now there is no way he can hit. All I have to do now is get the ball. Like, he could have, even if he bowled a half volley outside off stump, Steve Smith would not have been able to hit that ball.
Yeah.
Right? And if he got anywhere in the stumps. And so I do think there was a limitation to his T20 bowling. Someone told me the other day that he's got the most wickets of any T20 bowler not to play in the IPL. You know, I think that might have been a comment on the YouTube piece, or maybe someone sent that through to me. I can't remember. But it's a really interesting fact. But there is a part of me that, because of the Steve Smith stuff and watching him bowl, I watched him bowl a lot in the Blast over the years. And there were times where I just thought, well, this is a pointless endeavour because he's too fast for any number 6 in the UK to come out and hit, right? They're just not, you know, the best Blast players are in the top 5, right? And once he gets through, you know, once he comes on later on, he was too quick. I would have loved to have seen him tested more. But, as you said, he dominated the PSL, right? He was very good in most of the leagues that he played in. And so there is a part of me that thinks, no, maybe if he just played more international cricket, he would, or in the IPL, he would have been a better T20 player. And we're kind of fixating on the things that, you know, the one weakness in his T20 record is the internationals, right?
Yeah.
That's the only real weakness there. And so generally, I would disregard that and say he was so good, so consistently. I think, what did I say he was the 11th? He's one of 11 or 12 bowlers or 20 bowlers to ever take more than 5,000 wickets in T20 cricket, or 4,000 wickets, or whatever that number was. You know, we're not talking about someone who was good just a couple of times. We're talking about someone who took a lot of wickets. And that was his role, and he did it very well.
I think you meant 400 to 500, not 1,000. That would be a lot of wickets in T20 cricket. But
I do think I fit him at 400 to 500. You're right, but I did do a piece the other day on a guy on a bowler called Tom Cartwright who took 1,500 first-class wickets. So I do have the thousands in my head at the moment.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's and one more thing. Sorry, I need to add that I think that Wahab, the T20 bowler, got better with age. Of course, now he was done, but later
before he was
on
done,
in his
I
career,
think you're right.
Yeah, later on in his career, he became a better bowler. When he made a return to Pakistan's T20 international team, he won them a game in England in which he literally, you know, bowled brilliantly at the death and kind of, you know, won Pakistan that game and helped them draw the series. So I think, you know, early days Wahab was a bit more erratic. Later on, he had honed his skills, and I mean, age just wasn't on his side, and he was losing some clicks as well. But Wahab,
I don't think he was a smart bowler when he started cricket. And I don't think you would say he was a smart bowler when he finished. But what he was is someone who knew the 2 or 3 things that worked for him. And when he got those things to work, there wasn't a lot you could do to stop him because he was that fast, he was that ferocious. And once he found a rhythm, he was very hard to get away. What he probably didn't have of those, some of those other 400 and 500 wicket takers in T20 cricket is he probably just didn't have the range of other skills to put around that. And, you know, he wasn't a player that could beat you in many different ways, but when he was at his best, he could beat you with the one thing he needed to beat you with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And now let's move to Wahab, the ODI bowler. This is the more fascinating one. And I think the when we truly felt that Wahab had arrived was that semi-final in Mohali in 2011, because that was a controversial pick. Now, Shoaib Akhtar was supposed to be playing those games, but Afridi and Waqar dropped him, and there was a lot of controversy, and Wahab came in that sort of pressure situation. Sehwag was going crazy, got him out first, then bowled that worldie versus Yuvraj Singh. Ended with 5 for 46. Of course, Pakistan lost, but that was a lasting image, you know. Wahab came up trumps when the chips were down, and he performed at the big stage. And you very interestingly pointed this out in your piece, and I had no idea that this was one of the things that really, you know, caused his decline, is that in October 2011, when ODI cricket moved towards 2 new balls, and 2 balls, you know, used throughout an innings, up until that time, in 22 games, Wahab was amongst the top 3 or 4 bowlers in ODI cricket, right? And then he simply could not adapt to the 2 new balls, and his overall figures don't particularly scream stellar when you look at them right now. So how did you even come to this finding? Is this something that you had in your mind? Because you did the whole Malinga comparison of low arm actions, and I just want to know like the thought process behind it.
No, the Malinga thing came from the stats. I had a feeling that at one stage he'd been a very good death bowler.
And he could reverse it, right?
Yeah.
Really, really well.
And then I think when I looked at his overall numbers, I saw a pattern that he got a lot worse after 2011. So straight away in my mind, I was like, well, that's an interesting year to get bad in.
Yeah.
All right. And there are a lot of bowlers whose figures are worse after that, because obviously there was a lot of the one problem with ODI cricket is very hard to actually work out exactly what changes things, because there's so many law changes and regulation changes and everything that, you know, affect things. But that was one that I had seen that pattern before, but his pattern was really bad.
Yeah.
Up until 2011, certainly I didn't look at his overall figures. I can't remember, but or I didn't put them in the piece. But his overall figures were really good. It was the death where I think I had him as the 3rd best bowler in the death from overs 30 to 50, which is kind of when you expect him to be good. What was shocking to me is how bad he was after that 2011 period. And the whole 2 ball thing. I know there's a lot of Asian cricket fans who think it's a conspiracy against Asian teams. The truth is that we were using 2 balls before, right? And that's never talked about enough.
34th over, right? That's when you changed the ball? 34th over?
Exactly, right? And what was happening before is you had an older ball that was absolutely falling apart, and, you know, you came to a point where it had to be replaced. And, you know, because of that, we had an older ball that you could work on, that you could get to reverse a little bit. But it's not just about the reverse, because you can get a ball to reverse in 20 overs in a T20 game sometimes. It's the ability to work on it over a long period of time that was really helpful. But the other thing that helped, I think, specifically players like Malinga and Wahab is because they were bowling with low arm actions, that you were then bowling with a soft ball and they were bowling into the FootMarks over and over again. Unless you absolutely middled one of their deliveries, right? It was very hard to get them away. Suddenly you're in a period now, in a part now where you are, suddenly you find yourself in a position where the ball is harder at the end, right? It's not tailing as often, right? And it's also, and this is a really crucial thing, I think, for guys who bowl Yorkers, it's easier to see. Right? The other balls were just falling apart, and by the end of the game, they weren't as easy to see. And when you're, you know, if you've played cricket, you'll probably know this. If it gets dark, the best thing you can ever do is bowl full. Right? The fuller you can bowl when it gets dark, the absolute better, because you're looking for the ball to hit the pitch and then play it. If it doesn't hit the pitch, it just gets a little bit tougher. You know, Joel Garner in the 75 or 79 World Cup, you know, Flintoff with that spell against Callis. That's what bowlers generally start to do when you struggle to see the ball. All of those things, all those 3 different things were taken away from him. And look, everyone gets worse after that period, but no one else goes from the 3rd best bowler to the 40th best bowler, right? Or whatever it was, 28th best bowler, I can't remember. But he goes from the top of the list to the bottom of the list. Malinga has a big drop-off as well, but I think Malinga had probably other skills. And the fact that Malinga put the under revolutions on the ball, I think did actually make it a little bit different for him. So he survived a little bit more. But there's absolutely no doubt that in Wahab's case, it took him from being one of the best bowlers in the world to one of the worst. Now, the interesting thing about this is no one ever told him this. right?
Yeah.
And did he know this? Did he keep bowling the same all those years, and not being able to make it work? Is there something else he could have tried? And this is, I've said this a lot before. It's all well and good for someone like me finding it when you're retired. There's a lot of people who work in Pakistani cricket. He is an above average talent. If they didn't get the most out of him, they only have themselves to blame at a certain point.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know that Pakistan cricket was obsessed with his wrist position, right? That Wahab could only get it to tail away from the right-hander, and that was his limitation, and he needs to work on getting the ball to move back in or jag back in. I know that this was like a big point of contention at one point, and you're right. Maybe if someone had, just worked with him on how to kind of hone his skills with, two balls and how to be better at the death or closer to what he used to be. Because you did the whole crazy 8 thing in the article, right? Bowlers who have gone for over 8 runs and over in 8 over spells, and Wahab had 7 of them. And this is a guy who I in my piece mentioned that nearly became the only bowler in ODI history who went for over 100 runs twice.
That's why I looked it up when you wrote that, because suddenly I had this flashback of all these times I'd seen him go for massive figures. And so it's a metric I made up, right? Like it doesn't exist and may never exist again. But what I was trying to get at is that I felt that my modern, outside of the World Cup stuff, my real memory of him was how many times you would watch him and he'd go for 70 runs, right? And he'd really get smashed around everywhere and sometimes not even finish his spells, which for a frontline bowler, when you can't really bat, we know he could hold a bat, and you talked about that in your piece, but he was never an all-rounder or anything like that. He wasn't even Mitchell Stark level bat, right? He was that level below who could occasionally be handy for you in a pressure situation with the bat. But for him to not finish his overs, and I had this memory of it, and so when I looked it up, and so the only bowlers I'd found who had done it more were in his era, because I only looked at his era, were Southee and Malinga. And both of them had done it from 50 more games or 100 more games. Like he had by far the worst percentage of any guy who'd bowled a lot had never had beaten that made up figure, the crazy 8 figure that I came up with before. So he may not be as an expensive bowler as Jade Dernbach was in his career, right? But I think you could make a pretty big argument that Wahab Riaz was the most expensive, consistently picked player for his nation that we probably ever had in one-day cricket, right? I don't think we've ever had another bowler who bowled, took over 100 ODI international wickets at the kind of rate that he went at consistently for his era.
Yeah, and he had a couple of different spells as well in the team because he had, he was competing with the likes of Junaid Khan at times, who was another left-arm bowling option for Pakistan. A lot of people think that Junaid should have played more than Wahab, and of course that is probably need another different podcast for that. But let's talk about Wahab and World Cups, because that was the inspiration for my piece, and then it's also something that you mentioned. When you came across your research or my piece or whatever, were you shocked to learn that Wahab is the second most successful Pakistan bowler in World Cup history? I mean, he's got 35 scalps in 20 innings at 26.45, which is less than over 8 runs of his career average in ODI cricket, which is quite remarkable. I mean, it's a shell shocker, but then not really. If you've seen Wahab in World Cups, kind of makes sense.
I think the thing that shocked me, it didn't shock me once. I read your piece and you had the 2011 World Cup, then you had the 2015, then the 2019. And suddenly I was thinking, it's a bit like an Olympic athlete, right? Liam Plunkett's another guy who played in, did he play in 2 or 3 World Cups as well? Despite
I think he was in 2007.
Yeah.
Plunkett was in 2007.
Do you know what I mean? And then 15 and then 19. Right?
Yeah.
I think that's right. And yet Plunkett didn't play that much cricket for England. Right? And so I think Wahab's another one of, my shock was more that he'd played enough to have the second most wickets. Not that he could have taken them, because, I remember the India spell, and I remember him taking, regular wickets during the 2019 World Cup, and obviously, the famous spell in 2015 World Cup. So it wasn't shocking to me that he took wickets. It was shocking to me that he didn't actually play that much one-day cricket, but actually played a lot of World Cup cricket.
Yeah.
Right? Which I felt was a really... And that, to me, again, shows that Pakistan kind of knew he was more talented than their other players, but at the same stage, they didn't really trust him enough to have him in the side at all times, which is quite a fascinating one. But if you think about it, Shoaib's the only one I was confused that wasn't higher, right? So Imran Khan played a lot of World Cups and played a lot, but wasn't always a frontline bowler, especially towards the back end of his career.
Yeah.
Waqar Younis didn't play as much in World Cups as he should have. Like,
Injured in 92, played 96, featured in one game in 99.
Exactly.
And then 2003 was just terrible, right, for Pakistan. So
yeah. Did he play in 2003?
he was the captain in 2003.
Of course. So, you've got, he's 8 years past his prime by that stage, right?
I mean, after his injury, he was never the same sort of threat, right?
No, but by that stage, he'd gone right off the edge of the cliff. So you once you take those two out, you're just like, well, there aren't that many other options. The spinners usually don't stay around for more than a series or two, or a World Cup cycle or two. Mushtaq Ahmed probably should have had 3 World Cups. Saqlain Mushtaq probably should have had 3 or 4 World Cups. But the point is that these guys all played a lot of one-day cricket, and Wahab didn't. And again, I think from reading your thing, that when I first had this piece in mind, obviously the Steve Smith ball was one of the first things that came to my mind. The Shane Watson spell was another thing that came to my mind. The test stuff didn't come to my mind as much. I couldn't think of many other T20 moments, right? But I did have a lot of World Cup moments with bat and ball and, throwing himself around the field and all these sorts of things. And you thought, World Cup Wahab is a thing, right?
Yeah. And maybe that's what we should call this.
I nailed it there. But that really was a thing, right? Where he had a life in World Cups. And when you look at his record in World Cups, as you said, fantastic amount of wickets in World Cups. You suddenly think, well, what the fuck was he doing the rest of the time? Right? And it's a really, really interesting thing of looking back on it, because the 400 or 500 T20 wickets that he's taken, you can't be a guy who only gets up for certain events and takes that many wickets in one format of the game, right? And yet, he is the guy that only got up for certain events, realistically. And we did see the best out of him out of the World Cup. And, that was something I got from your piece. And I didn't want to go as deep as your article, but what I really wanted to do is use a couple of key moments, throughout those. And I think, and I'm sure we're going to get there, but hopefully I'm not jumping the gun on you. But for me, the most Wahab moment ever is the Shane Watson spell in Adelaide, right? And the reason it was the most Wahab, and it's the reason why I finished the video on it, or the article on it, is because it was him at his absolute best. And yet Pakistan don't win, and he only gets 1 wicket. And the amount of times that he would bowl like a 4-over spell, right? And, I checked my notes before I made this thing, and there were all the great spell by Wahab, right? And then you look up at his overall figures in that game, and it's like, took none for 69 of 10, right? Great spell by Wahab, and he took 2 wickets in the second innings of that test match. And there was something about him that just never quite clicked. And at World Cups, we would often see the best of him, but I don't know how many of those best moments actually resulted in Pakistan winning games, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know maybe that's just dumb luck, right? But there's something to be said for the bowler who does that. And I don't know, I just found the whole thing so fascinating.
Yeah, it is a bit bizarre now that you mention it, because in that India game, of course, Pakistan should have chased that 260-odd target, but they didn't. They absolutely shat the bed over there. And then, as we said in a previous podcast, lit it on fire, because that was not a game Pakistan should have lost. They were going so well initially and then just completely collapsed like Pakistan so often does. But, Wahab at that point might have thought, I don't know if I'll get another World Cup. But then the next one, he was the MVP. He wasn't just Pakistan's best bowler. He was Pakistan's best player. He made it to the team of the World Cup because he had, 16 wickets at 23 apiece and 83 runs at like 21 with the bat. And he also became the first Pakistani versus Zimbabwe in a game that Pakistan nearly lost to take 4 wickets and score a 50 in the same World Cup game. So that was another record. And then, of course, the Watson spell. And I love how you describe the Watson spell as, Pakistan only have 213. Wahab is just giving it everything he has, and this is like the last innings he'll ever bowl in. And he gets Michael Clarke off a short delivery, which, of course, with the troubled back was kind of, you could say, expected. David Warner got holed out to third man, I believe, which is also something we've seen frequently from David Warner. But Shane Watson, you mentioned, was someone who hadn't struggled versus the short ball up until that period at all. across both formats that he had played, or all three formats, whatever. And in that innings, like, Wahab had been sledged earlier, by the Aussies. And then he comes and bowls those rip snorters to Watson, which literally could have taken his head off, right? And he did a really good job ducking and shying away from those. And he's in his face, incessantly clapping. Everyone to date talks about that spell, even though Pakistan did not win. Wahab didn't even get Watson out. He could have. Rahat Ali dropped the catch, but
he had 3 decent chances, didn't he? Obviously. But you're right. And I think if you watch that spell, when he retired, it would be hard to not remember him as a better bowler than he was. Right? Because that spell was... I remember I was really sick. So I've been traveling around that whole World Cup, and I got really, really sick. And I think I might have been staying at my parents' place on the way before I was going back out on the road. And I didn't even want to watch that game, especially when Pakistan didn't make many runs. And then I remember him started bowling, and I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to have to, staple my eyes open to try and watch as much as this as I can. Staple my eyes open?
Yeah,
I don't know if you can.
So.
We could do that. Yeah, sure.
We could do that, yeah.
That's a thing now.
Very graphic, but it's a thing. It's
more painful than it needed to be. But and I just remember thinking, this is just an incredible moment. And I have, as I said, just so many mini moments of him doing stuff like that, watching on TV, being at the ground and feeling it, and then it not mattering and it not being the difference. And if you were to say to me that Wahab Riaz was a fantastic bowler, I don't know if I disagree with you. But if you look at his overall record, I don't think you could argue that he anywhere near lived up to the ability that he had. And perhaps it was something as simple as we talked about before, is that he didn't have a great stock ball like most other bowlers do, right? Perhaps it was that once in one-day cricket, his method didn't work anymore. He didn't have the ability to just change to another method. Perhaps it was treatment at times. Pakistan weren't quite sure about him, and he was in and out, and maybe he just was a rhythm bowler, and you had to pick him when he was firing and not pick him when he wasn't firing. Or we talked about the T20 stuff of perhaps he just had a level, and at that slightly lower level, he was absolutely unplayable. And once he got to that next level, when he was in full flow, he could do it, but when he wasn't in full flow, he didn't have the skills available to pull himself through. But it would be hard to argue he was a fantastic performer for Pakistan consistently or over a long period of time. And yet, we're here talking about him and have been for 37 minutes and 32 seconds at this point. And so you can't deny the impact he had on global cricket. But I think you have to be honest and say overall, he probably did not live up to the World Cup Wahab.
Yeah, it's interesting because you'll always get that highlights package of the Wahab spell to Watson, but it's a spell that didn't bring about victory. It's a spell that didn't even result in Watson's wicket, but it is one of those
they lost that game easily. Let's be... Yeah. Would they fall down when they chased it? With plenty of overs left?
At one point, they were like 60 odd for 3 and, had Pakistanis believing. I was in Canada up all night watching that game, and I had to not sleep at all and turn into work, which was something. But it's interesting how it'll always be one of those golden World Cup moments, like for forever. You'll always have that highlights package. You'll always have the tweet going out whenever it's on this day sort of thing, or Wahab's birthday or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's the spell people will remember. And that, I think, kind of signifies him so well, because it didn't result in anything, yet we remember it with, in all its glory, because it was just rock and roll and lovely to watch. And those sort of bounces you don't get to see every day. And even when
you don't see them in one-day games, right? You don't see a one-day player get worked over the way that Watson did. And as you said, not a particularly bad player of short pitch bowling. I don't think he was a brilliant player of it, but he certainly there wasn't a weakness that I could find in his game. And yet he was absolutely... He looked like he'd never seen short pitch bowling before in that spell. And... it wasn't a tough wicket to bat on, or, it wasn't it was an Adelaide Oval pitch, so it's an Australian pitch. There's a bit of pace and carry, but it wasn't the whacker, right?
I mean, he had Mark Taylor and Shane Warne on their toes as well in the comm box. I remember that because they were all praise. And I remember Warne, he just loved it. He loved the aggression, right? He was like, this is box office. And
at his best. Theater. Yeah, I think you wrote a really good line that I think I was going to put in my piece, and I've now forgotten it. But
is it the Sharknado line?
Maybe it was around that line. I had a couple of yours saved and then accidentally deleted them and couldn't find them again and was too lazy to go back. But essentially, he was. This is why I think this podcast exists. This is why I wrote the article. This is why you wrote the article. We wouldn't usually do this for a player who didn't get 100 Test wickets, who didn't play a lot of T20 internationals. Even if he played a few extra World Cups, I don't think we would normally put it this way. Did he have a much bigger impact on Pakistani cricket than JP Dumini did on South African cricket? Right?
Probably not, right?
And then that's not slamming either of them or JP Dumini. But JP Dumini, again, plays for, decade and a half for the national team.
Very reliable cricketer.
Yeah. 46 Test matches, 199 ODIs, 81 T20 internationals. I can promise you right now that when JP Dumini retired, we were not going to do a video on him. We were not going to do a podcast on him. You were not going to write a 3,000 and a half. And I don't mean you as, well, you cover Pakistan more and whatever. But I mean, South Africa, no one was going to write a 3,500 word. And look at all the words that were written about Wahab when he retired from international cricket.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
Part of this is he's a fast bowler, and we love fast bowlers. Part of this is he was a left-hander. Part of this was World Cup Wahab, right? We get all that, but it was more than that. There was a theatre to him when he was making it work that was unmissable. He was electric when he was running through that crease. And maybe you saw him do it 7 times in your life, right? But chances are you would remember that a lot more than you would another player who had a career over a similar amount of time, but maybe performed 3 times as well. Not 3 times as well, but 3, made a lot more runs, took a lot more wickets and all that sort of stuff. It's an undeniable fact that when Wahab Riaz was on one, right, that you wanted to be at the ground watching it or on a TV watching it, right? And those kinds of players are very rare. And it's why now we are sitting here talking about a guy who didn't take 200 international wickets, right? It is because, quite simply, he was absolutely fascinating to watch. Sometimes at his worst, but usually at his best.
Yeah, because even when he was at his worst, we have those moments that we remember of Wahab. And I love how you said, he might have only performed those 7 times, but we will remember them. And I guess just on a closing note, we've talked about his all-round ability, even though he wasn't an all-rounder, right? We talk about Pakistan's paces, current crop of paces, being really good fielders. But Wahab was the pioneer, right?
Yeah.
He would be throwing himself around. He would be taking those diving catches and stopping those boundaries. He set the bar really high. And with the bat, he was, no mug with the bat. He was a bit better than your average tail-ender in the sense that he would, win you some games batting at the end and, bail Pakistan out at times. The Rashid Khan 6 comes to mind. Afghanistan had Pakistan on the ropes in Headingley in the 2019 World Cup. This is old Wahab. He has a broken finger. Rashid Khan is arguably the best bowler in that, or spinner in that World Cup, and bang, hits him for a 6. The game, the complete, momentum of the game has shifted, and the complexion has changed, and all of a sudden now Pakistan win. So same World Cup, he also played a knock versus Australia, and all of a sudden you were like, oh, can Pakistan win this? They didn't. Sarfaraz got out and a whole lot of other stuff happened, but he did have that X factor coming in with the bat. And he was someone who just left it all out there, right? 110%, didn't, have any more gas left in the tank, gave it everything for the team. On a closing note, keeping all of those things in mind, where would you put Wahab, in terms of talent and potential, which was unfulfilled, I suppose?
There's a part of me that thinks that it's unfair. He definitely didn't live up to the raw skills he had. If you're a left-arm bowler who can move the ball laterally in the air, even not consistently, at that pace, you really should be a consistent test match threat. Test match, international threat. And he wasn't, right? I think we've proven that. If you want to have a look at the video and go through it step by step, you'll see what I mean. But he just wasn't that level of a threat.
Yeah.
And so if you're left arm and you're gifted with that much pace, you're guaranteed an international career, right? And he should have made more out of it. The only thing I would say is that there is a part of me that does think that he was treated like this prodigal talent in Pakistan cricket all the way through. And you talk about the wrist position. I think that's a really interesting thing that they obviously were trying to upskill him a little bit. But I know the same thing happened to Mitchell Johnson. Australia spent a generation trying to get Mitchell Johnson to fix his wrist position. And realistically, Mitchell Johnson's wrist position had nothing to do with him being successful or not when he was at his best. I think that had they followed a similar path to what Australia had done with Mitchell Johnson, and just be like, okay, he's not going to be a line and length bowler, but what we want him to do is find a zone, whether that be at the top of off stump, outside off stump, on top of off stump, back of a length, as you said before, whatever that may be. And he's going to hit that as hard as possible over and over again. And they just said to him, that's your job, right? And then when we need bouncer Wahab, we will call you. And when we need Yorker Wahab, we will call you. But this is all we need you to do. Essentially what Liam Plunkett did in the one-day side for England when he came back, right?
True.
I wonder if he'd been treated slightly smarter, if we'd be having the conversation about missed potential. It was a hard time to be a Pakistani player. He comes into the side. We talked about the jacket thing at the start.
Yeah.
But it was a weird time to be a Pakistani player. The other problem with Pakistan is, at any one stage, is there not a teenage fast bowler that everyone says is better than him?
There's always a teenage fast bowler in Pakistan that's better than him.
Yeah, right? And so, how much of that stunts the fact that he can't grow and he can't develop in the right way? He has to take some of the blame, because you cannot be that naturally gifted and end up with the test record that he has. It's impossible, right? Like, he should have done more of that. And we know that because when we saw him at his best, he was unplayable, right? But I do think that the environment that you are in and the situation you're in and the treatment that you get all plays a part. But yeah, I think Wahab Riaz, he'd be a really interesting media personality in the next 5 years, right? Because he reminds me of like a lot of those NBA players I follow that you just like, oh yeah, that guy could play. He, you know, as they'd say in basketball, he's a baller, right? He's a real hooper. Wahab Riaz was a real hooper. But there are certain times where you're just like, yeah, but if you just did this instead of the thing that you think is right all the time, there'll be something else there. So look, yes, I do think he did not make the most out of his potential. I didn't want to slag him off in the piece. It was funny that you weren't sure we should do this podcast because you thought I was maybe overly negative towards him. But I wanted to celebrate what he was great at, but I also wanted people to know that there was something missing there. And that he didn't perform at the level of our own imagination of him sometimes, right? And so, yeah, he definitely left something on the field from a talent perspective, but I wouldn't say that from an effort perspective. He talked about his batting and his fielding before and throwing himself around. And how many times would you watch him? And maybe this says something about his fitness, but he looked like he would bowl himself until exhaustion, right? He really, really did try very, very hard. Maybe we're being unfair on him, and he did get the most out of himself. But because he was so brilliant when he was on song, it just feels like he did leave something out on the field.
Yeah, it's interesting. Remember when we were doing the Stuart Broad podcast, you mentioned that Broad had a lot of things going on for him, right? But he didn't always get it all to click at the same time. When he did, he would get 8-wicket hauls. But even when he wouldn't, he would always get these wickets inconsistently and remain part of the conversation. I feel like Wahab is similar and dissimilar in a way. Similar in the sense that when he got it all right, we remember those moments, right? We'll never forget those moments. And that's why we're recording this piece or podcast. But when he got it wrong, he didn't have that Broad thing. He got it absolutely wrong. And that's, I guess, what makes this entire career so beautiful and worthy of a podcast. But I mean, anyway, on a closing note, go well, Wahab, if you were watching this. You know, we're all fans. We'll all remember those moments. And
I think, as I said, I think he'll have a fascinating career to go forward because he's bowled the best players in the world, right? He has those World Cup moments. I don't think he will disappear. He's a good-looking guy, and he's got a personality, all these different things. He set himself up for a really, really interesting career. But I would love to sit around the late night dinner table with him one night, and it's 11 o'clock and people have started to filter out and gone home. I'd love to say, what are you disappointed with? Right? Because you did absolute magic. But looking back, what did you not get? Because he does feel like, I don't want to give you another name for the title of this episode, but there is a what if Wahab. right? Of if he worked that middle bit out that you're talking about, that Stuart Broad thing of just being good enough when you're not on song to still be a threat. And that's what I was talking about before, having that good stock ball. Just keeping yourself in the conversation. Put it this way, Wahab Riaz either was the conversation or was out of the room. And that's the reason why he didn't have a brilliant record in the end. But it doesn't mean that he didn't leave us with a lot of brilliant memories.
Yeah, I mean, we'll always remember Wahab over someone like Rahat Ali. And Rahat Ali was probably a more consistent performer of Pakistan in Test cricket.
Rahat Ali is a GOAT, and I don't know why you would slander him on this podcast.
I wasn't slandering. I was saying that he's probably a more consistent performer in Test cricket.
You
given
didn't
that
say he was a GOAT, and so you slandered him. And, look, yeah. I mean, why? No one's, outside of you and me and about 7 other people, no one's going to remember Rahat Ali, right? Wahab is going to be remembered, right? The way that we tell stories, Wahab is the sort of person we're going to tell stories about, and Rahat Ali and JP Duminy are just not. Doesn't mean they weren't better contributors at times for their countries. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean anything other than the fact that Wahab is the person that you remember. That the World Cup Wahab, the what if Wahab, it was something so spectacular that it's tattooed on your brain.
Yeah, and that is definitely going to be the name of this podcast. Now, what if Wahab has a very Marvel feel to it? So that's what I'm going to go with. But anyway, thank you, Jarrod, for the time. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. That's it for this episode of FootMarks. We'll be back next week with another one. Till then, that's all for now. I'm Behram Qazi. With me was Jarrod. That's all. Goodbye.